Welcome, welcome in, everyone. Welcome to Care Concierge with Care Patrol, where education is the heart of everything we do. Our topic today for our continuing education unit is Hospice 101. And while it is a 101 course, I hope that you learn something and find some value in the hour that we're about to spend together. Thank you so much for taking time on a Friday to be here, for investing in yourselves and in your clients and patient care. We are a aging care navigation service at Carepatrol, meaning that we assist our clients in any number of choices of care providers. We're compensated only when we refer our clients to assisted living or independent living, memory care, or in-home care, rather. But 60% of the people who call us don't need those services or qualify. And so we give a lot of advice, and the love of educating others has led us to do this series. And we appreciate, hey, good afternoon, Ms. Fuqua. It's so nice to see you again here. And I was wondering, as I was looking at some of the names on the list, I mean, y'all come often, and I do appreciate it, but I got to wonder if you still need the CEUs or if you just like to spend time with us. I hope it's the latter. And I hope that each of you will feel free to discuss and add your voice to mine. And I think we would all agree that your voice and your perspective, your experience matters. And it will be enlightening, I'm sure, for some or all of the folks who get to see what you have to say. You can do so. You can give your opinions and say hello or ask questions, whatever you like in the chat room. If you're new to Zoom and you're not familiar with the chat room or how to access it, take your cursor and move it to the top of your screen. At that point, a black bar will likely pop down with the words chat on it, among others. If that doesn't happen, move your cursor to the bottom of the screen and the black bar will pop up there. Click chat and add your voice to mine. I know I will feel enriched by it, and I expect others will as well. We use an online evaluation tool here, and it is password protected. We give the password out at the end of today's session. So listen for that, and just know that you can't access the evaluation until the end of today. The Alabama Board of Social Work, who credentials us to provide this 1.0 contact hour, as well as the Alabama Board of Nursing, who also provides one contact hour. The Social Work Board allows us to use this password process as a way for social workers on the line to receive live or classroom credit for this hour versus recorded credit. And that's why we do what we do. I know that some of you are participating by phone or otherwise not looking at your screen. Let me read for you now the evaluation link, which you can access after today, or after this hour, rather. The link is https://www.surveymonkey.com/lowercase r/ all uppercase letters, T as in Tom, X, F as in Frank, 6, 5, F as in Frank, Y. That's our evaluation link. We'll give the password out at the end of the day. You must complete the evaluation in order to receive the credit for this hour. And again, it's password protected. Everyone who does the evaluation will receive a certificate and this presentation in an email from me tomorrow morning at the latest. and nurses will be loading your hours for you onto the ABN website. Again, thank you all for being here. Let's jump in. Our objectives today, as we discuss Hospice 101. I will put the link in the survey. Yes, ma'am. Ms. Kirkwood, there it goes. Our objectives for Hospice 101 are fairly simple. We're going to discover the history of the hospice movement, which we will discuss in great detail, because I think it's interesting, and I think you probably know a lot of the finer points of hospice, but I want to bring something new to you. We're going to define and contrast hospice care to palliative care, and the thing is that there's really not a lot of difference, and it's a pretty short discussion, but do listen for it. You'll be questioned on these objectives later. And then lastly, we're going to discuss trends in hospice care, which are also trends affecting healthcare. And I really do want us to discuss this because I really want to know your perspective on how things have changed for you and your office post-clinic or post-COVID, excuse me. So let me ask you, let me get the discussion started. Do other countries provide hospice, or is this limited to the United States? And then secondly, how long has hospice care been around? So if you have a guess, please open the chat room and let me know what your thoughts are about these questions. Do other countries provide hospice, or is this limited to the US? And how long has hospice care been around? So as you mull that over, Ms. Peters says, yes, they do, in the 1920s. That's an interesting point of view. Where we'll discuss it. We'll get into it because I want to know how you attribute the 1920s as the advent of hospice. I'd be really thrilled to know what you know. But hospice through the ages really has existed, so much as we understand that one of the root services that hospice seeks to deliver is care in your home or in a comfortable environment, surrounded by friends and family. The word hospice is medieval from the 11th century, and it was really probably more pronounced like hospice. And these were not care for the dying. Instead, these were lodging for travelers, the indigent, as well as the younger folks who may not have had as much money. These were typically run by religious orders, and they basically ceased to operate after the Crusades, which if you know about the Crusades, it makes sense that there would no longer be travelers because there were no longer people. In the 17th century in France, the Company of the Daughters of Charity of St. Vincent de Paul created what was really the first hospital or dedicated building with multiple rooms to house the sick. Now, in 1948, which is the date that is often attributed to Amy Fuqua says, yes, they do, 1960s, thank you. 1948 is when we may really credit the advent of the modern hospice movement with the ideas of Dame Cicely Saunders upon her return to, I believe at that point in her life, she was going back to get her medical degree, physician and surgeon. But she said, and she had noticed in her life, that as the body becomes weaker, so the spirit becomes stronger. And this led to her thoughts about total care and meeting the spiritual needs of those facing end of life, including the physical needs and pain cessation, but as well addressing the emotional and social needs. And her care philosophy, Dame Saunders, is, and this holds through in hospice and is really the advent or the cornerstone of hospice, is that you matter because you are you. You matter to the last moment of your life. Think about that. Embracing our death and our life to that point as having meaning and value and worth is a powerful thing. Now, hospice, as everyone knows, does exist around the world. And I would say that hospice has, again, existed throughout the history of humanity in the sense of being with loved ones. Now, in Asia, we really don't see a lot of hospice care, certainly not involving pain medication, because many Asians are Buddhist or Hindu and or some other meditative type religion in which they feel that going through the pain has its own value and is a time for reflection. And that this reflection and meditative state can produce a state of peace and calm. And so you do not typically, and it's advised against using pain or any medication or any stimulant or depressant when meditating. It's better to be clear. In Saudi Arabia, there is the King Faisal Specialist Hospital and Research Center providing hospice. And as you might imagine, it is very well funded and attended. In the Middle East, in general, though, a patient's group, again, family, friends, are expected to provide around-the-clock care and advocacy for the dying loved one. Now, in Eastern Europe, Russia approaches hospice in a little different manner than the United States, in that they have an abundance of inpatient hospice programs, and this is normal. The first hospice opened in Russia in 1990, and I would expect that Dame Cicely Saunders had a hand in that, and in Saudi Arabia and throughout Africa in the 80s and 90s. In Poland, it's traditional for the dying to stay at home, surrounded by family and friends up until the time of death. So you can see that hospice fits nicely over that cultural phenomenon. However, just to the south, Germany does not have widespread inpatient programs or hospice care. They do offer a variety of services, including psychological and social and spiritual, as well as alternative therapies that provide a hospice-like blanket. Now, in China, this is most interesting to me, in an inpatient facility in hospice, each patient has a nursing assistant who keeps a bed in the room with the patient so that they can attend to their needs round the clock. Those are the different approaches to hospice. And the history of hospice really would be in 1963, excuse my dogs, please. I'm so very sorry. Someone is obviously walking in the alley. They did that yesterday too, but for some reason, it's always new to my dogs. In 1963, Dame Cicely Saunders introduced the idea of specialized care for the dying to the United States in her lecture at Yale University. 2 years later, Florence Wall, the director of nursing at Yale, invited Dame Saunders to become a visiting faculty member. And in 1967, she left and created her own hospice in United Kingdom, St. Christopher's, which remains a guiding light for other hospices, as does Connecticut Hospice, very well respected in the hospice industry. During World War II, Dame Saunders decided to become a nurse. She was in school at the time, I believe, in art and philosophy, and changed gears. She returned to that same college, St. Anne's, and took a BA in medical social work in 1947. Now, working as a social worker in an existing hospice in the UK at that time, she fell in love with one of her patients who was dying of cancer. When he passed, he bequeathed her a small amount of money, which she used to create a stained glass window at the opening door of St. Christopher's Hospice, honoring him. And it's a lovely story. In the late 1940s, she began working at that hospice, St. Luke's Home for the Dying Poor. And this experience led her then to seek to be a physician as well as nurse, as well as social. She trained and was graduated in 1957, and she holds a degree in the English terminology as a Bachelor in Medicine and Social Work. But what that really would equate to in the United States would be being both an internist and a surgeon. Now, she was at St. Joseph's Hospice during this time, and she was there for 7 years and met a second patient who was also Polish, who was also Jewish, and she fell in love again, gratefully. His death in 1960, along with the death of her father, with whom was beloved, uh, threw her into a state of great grief. But it prompted her in that grief to seek to open her own hospice, St. Christopher's. And of her second love, she made the statement that I shared earlier that his death showed her that as the body becomes weaker, so the spirit becomes stronger. Now, in America, we credit Elizabeth Kubler-Ross as much as Dame Saunders for hospice work. And she was a naturalized citizen. She was Swiss, a psychiatrist, and she was considered a pioneer in near-death studies. In 1969, this would be 4 years after the formation of Connecticut Hospice, she wrote the seminal best-selling work on death and dying, which I'm sure is familiar to most of you. And in it, she described her theory of 5 stages of grief, which are also or had become known as the Kubler-Ross model. Now, we did a unit on complicated grief some months ago, and we learned in that unit that the Kubler-Ross model has been built upon, added to, subtracted from, and has now a number of different theories on grief. But each of these, mind you, would not exist without Kubler-Ross's method. The reason she had this fascination with death and dying and near death was that she, at age 5, was hospitalized with pneumonia, and her first experience with death was a child in the room with her dying. She felt that at that time, in her child's mind, she was somehow able to come to believe that death is a necessary stage of life and nothing more. And she, furthermore, at that tender age, came to believe that one must be prepared to face death and to do so with dignity and in peace. Now, as of 2019, on the 50th anniversary of the work on death and dying, it had been translated into 41 languages. And mind you, these are handbooks, no doubt, in hospices around the world. Now, in November of 1969, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was featured in an article in Life magazine. Now, you recall that Life magazine in 1969 was the equivalent of social media today. Everyone read it. And the response was so enormous about her work that it influenced her to focus the remainder of her career working with the terminally ill and their families. She stopped teaching at that point to work on what she called the greatest mystery in science, which is death. In the 1970s, on the heels of her work, she became champion of the worldwide hospice movement, and she and Dame Cicely Saunders installed a number of hospices around the world. She herself traveled to over 20 countries on 6 continents, initiating hospice programs. In 1977, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, was named Woman of the Year by Ladies' Home Journal, again, a leading publication at that time. I want to ask y'all if you'll join in the chat. Do any of you know the Kubler-Ross model? What are the 5 stages of grief? Do y'all know? I bet a number of you do. Please share it with your classmates in the chat room. What are the 5 stages of grief? Does anyone know? Anger, bargaining, denial, sadness. Yes, Miss Briggs. There's one more. Yes, what you know. Miss Briggs says she's missing one. Acceptance, said Mrs. Harris. Depression, Brittany Phillips says. Acceptance, says Miss Dean. Well, y'all are right on clue. So the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross 5 stages of grief are these. One is denial, the refusal to believe that the loss is real. This is part of complicated grief as well, when that denial extends for over 3 months. Anger, which is your frustration at the loss, your resentment of the loss, of the however, whomever might be responsible in your mind. Bargaining, and this is also a hallmark of complicated grief, which is the attempt to negotiate or change the outcome somehow, to go back in time. If only I had done this. Depression, yes, Miss Phillips, you hit it. A state of sadness and hopelessness, and we've done a number of CEUs on depression. And y'all, if you're listening today and you missed these, go to YouTube and put in the search bar in YouTube, Sean Barnes Care Patrol, and it will pull up a video which you can click then on my face and pull up the entire catalog. We have probably 80 to 85 CEUs posted there now. And you can receive credit for these, recorded credit, if you watch them and take the evaluation. The link is in each presentation. And acceptance, finally, which is recognition and acceptance of the reality of the loss. Now, Kubler-Ross later said that she did not intend for these to be necessarily sequential, that in fact, one or more may be present at any time and may arise again in the process. So these are not, although we've largely been taught they are, these are not sequential. I've asked y'all already, and you've already answered, but when did hospice care begin in the U.S.? In fact, I think I've told you. So this is sort of a moot question. But I want to, again, just drive home your understanding that hospice care in its present and modern sense is not yet 100 years old. In fact, it's about 80 years old, or not even 75. And so it's really a relatively modern concept in its full sense, certainly in medicine. And I see that no one took the bait, has answered the question. I'll tell you again, history of hospice in the US. And I said at the beginning, we're going to talk a lot about this because I think it's important. I think it's interesting to know the origin of something, to know the future of something. In 1969, we mentioned Death and Dying was published. In 72, Dr. Kubler-Ross testified before the US Special Committee on Aging about the right to die with dignity and to make decisions about one's end-of-life care and to die at home. In 74, Dr. Florence Wald, Dean of the Yale School of Nursing, founded Connecticut Hospice in Brantford, Connecticut, with help from Dame Saunders. And in 1975, on the heels of that, the first National Symposium on Hospice Care was convened in New Haven, Connecticut. In 78, the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare reported, or stated in a report rather, that the hospice movement is a viable concept and one which holds out a means of providing more humane care for Americans dying of terminal illness while possibly reducing cost. And they concluded as such, it is the proper subject of federal support. So these are the first calls, first to testifying before the Senate, and now the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, both suggesting this is something the federal government ought to look into and think about providing support for. In 1979, the Healthcare Financing Administration initiated programs at 26 hospices in 16 states. In 1980, the Kellogg Foundation, which many of you are aware of, awarded a grant to JCAHO to develop standards for accreditation of hospices. And then in 1982, Congress acted, and they included a provision to create a Medicare hospice benefit in the Tax Equity and Fiscal Responsibility Act, which would become law and take place in 1986. So in 1984, the Joint Commission accreditation program was completed and implemented in these hospices. And then in 1982, prior in 1982, private insurance companies followed Medicare's lead, as they often do, and added hospice benefits to private plans. In 85, the Consolidated Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act, which is a mouthful, made the hospice Medicare benefit permanent. And it made states, or gave states, the option to include hospice services in their Medicaid programs. And this was done through permitting payment to inpatient nursing homes for hospice patients who could reside there. Now, in 1988, CHAP, sort of JCAHO's twin, was created its own hospice accreditation program. And you'll see, looking across the country, that some hospices are accredited by JCAHO and others by CHAPS. Both are a seal of approval. In 89, Congress gave a 20% reimbursement increase and tied future increases to annual increases in the budget in the hospital market basket through the act. 91, the Department of Defense authorizes hospice care in military hospitals. In 97, the Balanced Budget Act restructured hospice benefit periods and removed the requirement that physician services be employees. It also reinstated the hospice cost report and reduced payment updates by market basket minus 1 percentage point. Now, this is an interesting point in hospice, and I would say this led to the explosion of hospice across the United States and the formations then of for-profit hospices. And this is because when the physicians, and this is a tool of for-profit hospices, when the physicians do not have to be employees, to be medical directors, then they can have more than one, because those physicians have clinics or practices elsewhere. And what happens then, in the case I remember when I was in sales of hospice, one national provider was known to have 12 medical directors in a small community in Florida. And this meant that they had 12 referral sources constantly funneling them patients. So this was clearly eschewed by the nonprofit hospices and family-owned hospices who felt this was predatory, which it was. But this was why hospice exploded in '97. In 2001, a 5% increase in Medicare reimbursement rates was added to the budget. 2001, and this was where you might have been confused, as was I, the Healthcare Financing Administration, or HCFA, changed its name to the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, which we know as CMS. Now, in 2005, and I probably am showing my age here, does anyone remember Terry Schiavo? I'd love to hear if anybody remembers Terry Schiavo in the chat room. No Terry Schivos? Yes, I do. I remember her. I do. I'm old. Me too. Thank y'all. You do remember. And if you remember Terry Schiavo, you remember that this was a woman who had been in a coma state for probably a decade or more. Her husband was in favor of removing the life-sustaining apparatus, but her parents were opposed. And this became a large court case with a lot of media attention. And naturally, this discussion evolved into hospice. And so hospice took a bump in its recognition, but it also took a dip in people believing that it was the right thing, because people began to believe that hospice was for someone about to die. Now, in 2005, the number of hospice provider organizations topped 4,000. And this is what I mean by the explosive growth of the for-profits. In 2007, the Journal of Pain and Symptom Management reported that hospice patients in their studies lived an average of 29 days longer than similar patients with similar diagnoses and terminal illness who did not have hospice care. Now, this is an oft-repeated statement about hospice, is that patients live longer. How much longer? An average of 29 days. In 2009, the Accreditation Council for Graduate Medical Education, ever slow, added hospice and palliative medicine to its list of accredited programs. Ms. Briggs, this is why educating our clients and encouraging living wills, POA, advanced directives is so important. It is. Terry Schiavo makes that very clear. If those things had been in place, none of that would have happened. None of that tragedy to both sides, the husband and the parents, and certainly to Ms. Schiavo. In 2010, y'all remember this, the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act passed, and the provisions therein required state Medicaid programs to allow children who have a life-limiting illness to receive both hospice care, which would be the spiritual, social, emotional, as well as pain support, and curative treatments, which are typically discontinued when someone elects hospice. And in 2016, CMS launched a hospice payment reform. Anyone working in hospice, I'd love to hear how it has affected you, the 2016 patient reform. So we've covered a history, I think, in depth. I hope that held your attention. How does hospice work, y'all? Anyone working in hospice on this course? How does hospice work, y'all? Do you know this? I expect you do because of what you do, but let's dive in a little further. Well, hospice works and it's only covered by Medicare if your hospice provider is also Medicare approved. This is almost always the case, not always, but almost always. And to find out if a hospice that you have an interest in is Medicare approved, you could ask your doctor, which you would be doing as you were discussing, maybe electing hospice. You can approach the hospice provider themselves. Our state hospice organization would have a list of accredited programs, or approved programs rather. And of course, our state health department could be an assistance. Now, if you're in a Medicare Advantage plan, most of these are PPOs or HMOs, which require a referral, remember, or they won't pay and you'll be stuck with the bill. And if you want to start hospice care on a Medicare Advantage plan, ask your plan to help find a provider. And your plan, in fact, must help to you locate one in your area. So take that away about Medicare Advantage. Now, hospice care, and we said we would address this too, is often confused with palliative care. Both offer a similar service in pain control and keeping patients comfortable. But in general, hospice is for those who have a terminal illness and also a physician diagnosis stating that they likely have 6 months or less to live. Now, the services provided are this philosophy of care, again, that originated with Dame Cicely Saunders to ensure that the patient is kept comfortable and able to enjoy a higher quality of life during their final months. Now, rather than attempting to treat illness to cure, hospice addresses instead the physical and emotional and spiritual. Now, utilizing hospice care is not about hastening the end of life. This is a misconception. Instead, it is about ensuring that a loved one, a patient, spends the remaining time they have in as comfortable a position as they can be, and environment, and surrounded again by family and loved ones. Ms. Fuqua, thank you for your comment. She says that she works in hospice, and our company, she said, has home hospice and an inpatient. I'd love to know what it is. There's so few inpatient units, hospice houses. Is it a hospice house or an inpatient unit? Most payer sources are Medicare. We see a large number of referrals from hospitals. However, others come from doctor offices, cancer centers, even other hospice agencies. That's so true. And I do think that's important to know that, those of you who work with someone in a sales function for your company, I think it would be very gratifying to know that that person is not only trying to serve and to gain patients for you, but is looking out for the interest of the patients and recommending other hospices if they might be more appropriate. Oh, the retreat, says Miss Fuqua, hospice by SAD in Mobile, Alabama. I used to call on SAD Healthcare when I sold hospice, and that is a wonderful, well-run organization. Now, let's continue with hospice care discussion. Let's see if I can do this. Now, again, the patient must be certified as terminally ill if they wish to qualify for hospice care. A doctor who is looking to make that diagnosis would typically look at three key areas. No improvement in the condition of the patient when there's no sign of progress despite treatment. There is patient themselves will decide to end treatment, upon which the physician will naturally launch into or should launch into a discussion about hospice care and can recommend both hospice care as well as, which hospices would be best. Oh, Miss Bird said her uncle was at Sad Hospice and was very happy. Oh, this is lovely. Thank you all for talking to one another here and using this as a safe place. I'm so gratified. And then lastly, the physician may be looking at very acute events such as stroke or heart attack, which leaves the patient unable to resume life and unable to care for themselves and requiring end-of-life care. So how long does it last then? If someone gets a diagnosis of less than 6 months to live, how long does hospice care last? Well, it's set up obviously for patients who are expected to have less than 6 months left to live, but no one knows when we go except perhaps our God. A significant number of people in hospice live less than 15 days, and an equally significant number live more than a year. So clearly, at 6 months, the patient would be considered to still have a terminal illness, which will likely lead to the end of their life within the next 6 months. Now, sometimes, obviously, people exceed expectations, and this is necessary. The hospice obviously will require an assessment by the physician and by their own nursing staff to determine if this is truly a patient that can be on hospice. Now, here's another thing about hospice from my experience working with it. Hospices lose money on people living less than 15 days. So in order for us to keep hospice programs growing, we need to refer clients much sooner than this. And if any of you work in home health or hospice, you know that the costs are borne on the front end of care, setting everything up. And then it's not until a few weeks later that you begin to show some profit. And so when people are dying in 15 days, hospices are hanging on, y'all, hanging on by a thread. Of course, they want those that live more than a year, but that's the exception, not the rule. Two things about that. My stepdad was referred to hospice. The hospice nurse came to say hello, and before she could come back to do her assessment, he died. Clearly, that was a too late referral to hospice, but in part because he chose to continue treatment for his multiple myeloma. Unfortunately, it didn't work. And then I want to tell you about someone who lived in hospice for more than a year. And again, I'm going to show my age, but there is a humorist in the 80s, maybe even into the 90s, named Art Buchwald. Art Buchwald was a sort of political commentator, opinion writer, and he was very funny. And he was often on 60 Minutes or the news or 2020 or something of that sort. And he lived at the Washington home in Washington, D.C., which is an inpatient hospice program that I visited, which is very sophisticated, beautiful facility. He lived there for 3.5 years on hospice. And talk about living his best life. He wrote a book about it while on and in hospice. And so people do live longer. And in his case, he lived a vital life on hospice. Now, how would you decide if you were thinking about hospice care for a loved one? What would be the things you might look for in addition to what the physician might look for? You certainly would want to consider hospice if your patient is having trouble swallowing. If they have constant shortness of breath, if they're unable to perform the daily activities of living to keep them housed safely and properly, if they show increased fatigue with the acts that they do perform, if they are going more and more often to the hospital, or if they're in pain, or if they're sad. Now, doctors may suggest for these reasons, but certainly frequently returning to the hospital would be chief among their thinking, or sleeping more than 12 hours a day, or eating less and losing weight, or speaking just a few words. Now, you could think that in any of these cases, hospice care is perhaps even overdue for your patient. Ms. Peters says, agreed. Also, having the family longer helps with staff being able to learn and assist the family better. Great point, Ms. Peters. Thank you. What are the 4 levels? Ms. Smith says the patient should be asked what they want too. Absolutely. Absolutely. Uh, absolutely. And many people elect hospice on their own. I guess the majority, in fact, do. What are the 4 levels of hospice care? Have y'all ever heard these or heard this? Are you familiar? What are the 4 levels of hospice care? Does anyone know? General inpatient routine rest. Yo, Amy Fuqua, you nailed it. What are the 4 levels of hospice care? Routine care. This is predominant in hospice. This is what the majority of people end up doing in hospice is routine care. And this is provided in the home or wherever the patient lives and calls home. It might be 2 to 3 visits weekly by a hospice nurse who will assess the patient, provide medical services such as pain control, and an aide who will visit weekly to help with activities of daily living, most typically and most often bathing. Social workers and chaplains visit as needed, on request or otherwise. And this is the real benefit to me or of the hospice care, which is the spiritual connection and the social work connection, the ability to perhaps connect you with a bucket list of people you want to connect with. This is what social work is for in hospice, is to help you come to peace with what's happening and take ownership and accountability and direction of the process with the social worker's help. The general inpatient care, as Ms. Fuqua stated, is for patients whose symptoms are rapidly changing and they can't be managed any longer safely at home. They would be admitted into a facility to receive round-the-clock care. Respite care, which is, again, an exceptional benefit of the hospice benefit, allows caregivers to admit their loved one into a skilled nursing or hospital room for a limited number of days to allow that caregiver to recoup and recharge and recover, which is so necessary with giving care to the dying, which is 24/7. And then there's continuous care for those patients who are actively dying and need 8 hours or more of continuous care from a medical professional. And I will say that in my experience, hospice nurses and staff have an uncanny ability to determine when the dying process starts and how long someone has. I've always been impressed by that ability of those hospice professionals. Well, how much does it cost, y'all? How much does hospice care cost? Well, it differs depending on the needs of the patient. It could easily reach tens of thousands a year. It's fully paid by Medicaid and Medicare and private insurance. It also includes everything under Medicare, including the support and medical equipment and pharmaceuticals. Also covers emotional and spiritual needs, again, on the dime of Medicare. Now, let's look at what are the hospice reimbursement rates today, just to give you a sense of the dollars that hospices are working with. And the benefit is calculated upon the hospital services market basket by the government and Medicare, CMS. A market basket, if you're not familiar, is simply a grouping of different products or services or assets by which the economists use that group and look at the cost increases within that group over time and use that information to predict future cost increases. So a market basket is just any group of products. For example, in hospice, you might look at the cost of durable medical equipment and of disposable medical. And I think by tracking those costs and maybe adding pharmaceuticals, you would have a great indication of the increase in cost in the hospice marketplace in general through that, looking at that smaller market basket. You probably all have heard of the Consumer Price Index. That's the most well-known estimate for inflation. And basically, again, tracks services and goods over time to predict, using data points from the past to predict the future. The final increase approved in 2022 for fiscal year 2023 for hospice provided a 3.8% increase. And that's about 825 million additional dollars annually, or this year rather, to hospice. The final hospice cap for any given patient is $32,486.92. Now, this 3.8% increase to me is very generous. It's normally 2.7. But if you look at the cost of, or the increase that Social Security recipients are receiving in 2024, as they did in 2023, is a 3 I think it's 3.2, it might be 3.4%, which is essentially a cost of living allowance raise. So they're adding 3.4%, Medicare is adding 3.8. That's a lot of money, y'all. Now, in terms of the routine home care per day, a hospice would expect to receive $203.40 on days 1 through 60. Days 61 plus, or through 90 in theory, but 61 plus, the home care cost per day would move down to 160.74. You can see from that number what I was saying earlier, that the costs are borne on the front end. The continuous home care, if someone were receiving 24 hours daily per day, would pay the hospice $1,462.52. An inpatient, $473.75, and general inpatient, $1,068.28. So have no concerns about whether or why hospitals and skilled nursing facilities keep hospice beds on hand for respite or inpatient care. Essentially, these places have an empty room, maybe an empty wing, in which they do really virtually nothing, and pocket $473 a day or $1,068 a day. I must say that not to disparage those entities, but rather to say that it is widely available. Ms. Clopton says Medicaid stipulations are strict, must document very good for it to pay, and continue to qualify under Medicaid. I have no doubt about that, Ms. Clopton, especially in the state of Alabama. What's the difference, y'all, between hospice and palliative care? This is a softball question. I know you know the answer. What's the difference between hospice care and palliative care? Well, many people confuse the two, and they do provide similar services to similar patients, but they're really two different strands of end-of-life care. Hospice care is there to provide comfort and support, as well as pain relief. And it is typically, usually, the final stage in palliative care. Palliative care would be sooner in the disease state and process and illness, and it's typically for patients who have serious illness but are not yet threatened by it. And it would allow the patient to both seek the comfort or pain relief while also still pursuing curative treatment. That's the reason that people may elect to do palliative and then advance to hospice, or never advance to hospice. And palliative care can be for the same illnesses as hospice, clearly, such as cancer. But it's designed to relieve symptoms and can be at any stage from diagnosis to curative treatment. So palliative care could truly begin at diagnosis if one had stage 3 or 4 cancer, let's say. Now, hospice today and in the future, the hospice care industry has evolved. it was at one time a constellation of charities and universities like the Connecticut Hospice, and it was mostly reliant on volunteers to provide services, including physician and nursing care. It has evolved into a $22 billion industry, and this is funded almost exclusively by us, the taxpayers. And I would say that there is no better money spent in terms of tax dollars than the Medicare hospice benefit. So the opportunities and challenges, the transformation of post-acute care in America study published this past year, identified for 5 key trends that influence the course of post-acute care since COVID-19. One is declining hospital admissions. 2 is rising demand for post-acute care. 3 is the shift of more care into the home. 4 are capacity constraints due to the labor shortage. And 5 is patients are coming in now sicker than before because they held off coming during COVID. And so my question for y'all is, how have you in your clinic or practice or office been affected by these 5 challenges to healthcare in the era now that we're in of, I don't want to say post-COVID, but post the advent of COVID? So have you seen a decline in your patient population in terms of admissions, or have you seen that your patients are in greater need of post-acute care than before? Have you noticed that Medicare is shifting us now from skilled nursing rehab into home health services in the home for the simple reason that it's about 25% the cost to do home health versus to do skilled inpatient rehab? And then have you seen, and I know the answer is yes to this, what capacity constraints have y'all had to implement to not having the staff to do the work? And then lastly, have you noticed that your patients are sicker? This was the discussion portion that I hope to get into. But let's conclude because we're running out of time, and I apologize, y'all. So many people are under the misconception that hospice means I'm dying right now, said Dr. Phil Santamaria, who is the medical director of hospice and palliative care services at Mount Carmel Health System. I believe that's in California. And he said, we have to reframe that. Hospice is going to help me live the very best I can. And even though I have a terminal illness, I know I'm mortal and I know I'm going to pass away. But between now and then, how do I live the best that I can? Now, Jennifer A. Weingarten is a hospice consultant who consults the Mayo Clinic, and she said, agreed with Dr. Phil Santamaria, that the biggest issue is that people associate hospice with giving up. And I disagree, she says. She said some of her patients have told her they haven't lived this well for years. And she says hospice care is about bringing patients the greatest support and comfort with the time they have left. That's why President Carter, we haven't discussed President Carter today, but it did bring up the subject overall. President Carter's example is so important, she added. He's gotten to a stage where he wants comfort and dignity, she said. He's demonstrated to people how to do that. And I hope that his example does lead to greater utilization. Ms. Phillips says, with palliative care, would a patient be able to receive PT or OT? Yes, they would. And again, that's one of the reasons we look maybe at palliative care over hospice for certain patients. So our CEU code word for today is the word FOUR. And that's a capital F-O-U-R, FOUR. Everyone who completes the evaluation will receive a certificate and the presentation, and nurses, we will be posting your hours onto the ABN website for you. I'll get an email out probably sometime in the morning, although I do ask if you can to complete the evaluation today by 8 o'clock. I'll read again for you, for those who are newer to the call. I'll read the link for you, and the link is http://www.surveymonkey.com/all uppercase letters, T as in Tom, X, F as in Frank, 6, 5, F as in Frank, Y. That is our evaluation link. You must do the evaluation to receive credit for this hour if you're new to us, and you will receive credit via email. The link is password protected. The password, which is also the question 1 on the survey, is 4, the number 4, not the meaning spelled out, with a capital FOUR. Please send the evaluation link in this chat. I'll be happy to do that, Ms. Thorne. Here it is. And I'm typing in the code word again. And remember, it's a capital F4. Capital F4 is the password. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. We've run a little bit over. If there are no more questions about the evaluation, then I will end our session. Please join us on Monday, 3 days from now, when we discuss the latest on the COVID variants and vaccines at noon via this Zoom opportunity. I put the link into the email with the evaluation, so you'll see it there, and I'll look for you. I hope to see you then. Thank you all so much, Ms. Talbert, Ms. Phillips, Ms. Fuqua. Thank you for being here so often. You really enrich our conversation with your comments, and I'm so very appreciative. Y'all have a great weekend. See us. Please join us on Monday. We'd love to see you then. Y'all have a great rest of your Friday.